The dispatcher's often getting pressure from both sides, the driver and the carrier's upper management. And the driver's getting it from the dispatcher. So if these two can work together to achieve the goals, they both look like rock stars.
You're listening to Cents Per Mile with your host, Charles Gracey, and his co-host, Paul Gibson.
With our guests, Skip Lawrence and Justin Palionis.
They'll be tackling tough industry topics, asking even tougher questions, all to find better solutions to help make sense make sense.
Welcome to Cents Per Mile. I'm your host, Charles Gracey.
And I'm your co-host, Paul Gibson.
And today we're going to discuss what makes a good dispatcher or a bad dispatcher. And this is one of those unique things that dictate the pace after the recruiting, after the marketing, after all those initial things that it takes to bring a driver into an organization. To keep the driver within the organization, the day-to-day is going to be handled by a driver manager or a dispatcher. And those can go incredibly well and be lifelong friends and relationships, or it can go incredibly terrible and cost you driver turnover.
Yeah, no, I'm super pumped on this one. So who do we have as guests today?
So I'm excited about this. We have a return guest, Skip Lawrence.
Already.
Woo! All right. Joining us from the driver's side to communicate what his experience with the dispatcher is. And then we have Justin Palionis, who has been a dispatcher for several years now, risen through the ranks, and has lots of experience to share, both good and bad, through his transition in this role.
All right. Well, I think I've had experience interacting with operations departments and whatnot, but I feel like you actually spent time as a driver, so. In the ancient war that has been waged for over a century now, how do you feel about dispatchers?
Wow, we're just going to jump right in. And on this one, I'm pretty passionate because I think as a former driver and somebody that's seen a lot of the aspects of this industry, it's often the thing that everyone looks past knowing there's an issue and not really the thing anyone wants to look at to say, hey, let me fix this today. We all work very hard to have these very beautiful offers to attract drivers within our organizations. We all work very hard to communicate those offers throughout the world to get that reach out. What we don't do is look in our own house most often to where the dirty laundry might be that's causing the driver turnover. And to spend all that time and money and effort to do it right on this end and not look what's right here in front of you seems like a misstep. The driver manager, dispatcher, is the person that's dealing with that driver after they've completed orientation. Day in and day out, they're dictating the pace of the driver, their success within your organization, and not only that, but their income. But being on the driver's side was one aspect of my experience. Working in the office, I saw that there was a whole nother side of this, where the dispatchers were only as good as the people behind them, their supporting cast, and also depended on the driver for information. So it is a two-way street, and it could be a beautiful, prosperous relationship, or it could be absolutely catastrophic. It could be a hot dumpster fire. And it doesn't take long to go from here to here in trucking. So what makes it successful, in my opinion, would be, is the dispatcher communicating properly their expectations to the driver? Not only theirs as an individual to be successful together as a pair, but the organization's expectations from both the dispatcher and the driver, and what that organization, the company, feels is going to make them successful. The dispatcher's often getting pressure from both sides, the driver and the carrier's upper management, and the driver's getting it from the dispatcher. So if these two could work together to achieve the goals, they both look like rock stars. But again, it comes down to the most common thing we hear around here, communication. And if you don't have that communication, like I said earlier, you can have a massive dumpster fire on your hands. And it can cost you drivers. It can cost dispatchers a lot of undue stress and revenue. And we're going to hear a little bit about ways that we can address this. But we're also going to hear how drivers feel about this, what they think is most important to them out of a dispatcher. and maybe some other issues that we're kind of reserving for later on to talk about that I'm excited that someone's going to bring up. I'm kind of keeping that one behind the scenes for right now.
Right on. Well, and I think communication is it. Communication, and it's one of those things where it's crazy. I've seen it work one of three ways. Where it's like you have your cold collected dispatcher, and it's just like, here's your load, take it. It's like that.
And that, it.
Yeah, pretty much. Like in that, that doesn't last very long. Sometimes the dispatcher does, and that's usually not good for, anything. But anyway, and
isn't it weird though how that works in some cases? And you've been around this industry long enough. You see drivers cycle in and out, but sometimes the bad apples stick around.
Mm-hmm. Well, you ever wonder if that's what's making the driver cycle in and out?
No, I don't wonder. I've seen it.
It's one of those things where it's a really easy. Everybody wants to talk about retention and stuff like that on the back end, and a lot of times that could be it. I mean, because you got to think about it. Like I said, one of three ways. Either it's cold and collected, or it's like, almost like a customer service type thing. But then every now and then you'll get someone who's amazing at their job, and it turns into almost like an actual machine where you have this driver who is the eyes and ears on the road. And then you have this dispatcher who relies on that information to then help that driver get what they need. Because a lot of times I feel like in my experiences, it's really easy for dispatchers sometimes to just be like, oh, well, it's fine. It is whatever. It's, like figured out. That driver's like, no, man, you don't understand. There is 3 feet of snow on the ground. I have to pull over, and I've only got an hour and 45 minutes left, and I'm typically in good weather an hour and a half away from my location. It's understanding that understanding between, hey, I'm not there, I need you to tell me what's happening, but also, hey, this is what's happening on the back end while you're out there going down the highway. This may have changed. The customer needs this, that kind of thing. And it turns into when that communication exists and those stances and people's positions are respected in that case, it turns into a beautiful picture of efficiency, and everybody's actually making money.
Well, and I think it even goes a little bit deeper than that. To be quite honest with you, a lot of times the dispatchers are trying to help the driver progress, maybe offer advice, what they think a driver should be doing based on their experiences, maybe not experiences being inside the truck or driving through those blizzards or driving with a broken air conditioner in the middle of summer, whatever the case might be. It's easy to sit there and offer solutions if you've never been there. But what kind of solutions can you offer? And as a dispatcher, you're only good as the information you're getting from the driver. But as a driver, you're only as good as the information you're getting from the dispatcher.
Right.
So we circle this communication tree once again, and while we circle it, I just want people to think as we go through our guests today, what can we do better? Is it understanding? Is it empathy? Is it a combination of both with a general understanding that if we work together and work smarter, this is going to get easier and be more profitable for the company? Or do we just need to reinvent this wheel altogether, which, there's some people that are trying to do that. You see automatic dispatch software out there now, which I think is nuts. You're taking the human element out and saying, this computer knows this driver, how they run, the road, trucking in general, and I'm going to put all my faith in my business into this one program and take out the human element, and good luck.
Yeah, I mean, but hey, if it's working, and I mean, sometimes, like maybe it's the attention to detail. Sometimes software can pick that up a little bit better than people can right away. But also, I think there's a lot to be said about the human element in communication. But yeah, I'd be pretty curious to see what our guests say, and then kind of come around on the back end and see how we feel about it then.
Looking forward to it as always. So I'm going to bring our first guest on. Right now, we have Skip Lawrence, who joined us in our episode number 1 about driver appreciation and talked about his number 1 concern in trucking and how he felt that he could be appreciated most was better communication. So, Skip, welcome back to the show. Um, Happy to have you back.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
How's the road treating you?
So far so good. A lot of bug juice right now going on, but we'll clear that up in the next 3 hours.
Nice, nice. Well, you really resonated with our audience and ourselves as far as the communication piece. You were very passionate about that. So I appreciate you coming back to talk about what that communication means to you and what that means in your relationship with your dispatcher. So, with your experience and everything that you've been doing for this industry and trucking in general, tell us, what does that communication piece mean to you when it's coming in regards to a dispatcher, and what makes a successful dispatcher or a bad dispatcher?
I personally think that the communication between the driver and the dispatcher is very important. The planner plans the load, gives dispatch, then gives it to the driver. Driver accepts it, prepares, and goes. If there are any questions, then the driver should be able to call the dispatcher and say, "Hey, I got a flat tire, or something. I have to go home, or the route that is planned out for me is not a good route," or whatever the case might be. That communication between the driver and the dispatcher goes on. What tends to happen is the dispatcher gives you load, and then they're off dealing with other dispatchers and everything else. And that's where the communication part comes in at, because when I do call at 1 o'clock in the morning, I don't have my dispatcher. I have a nighttime dispatcher, and most of the time the dispatchers at night don't have the information, do not have access to it, or cannot make a decision that a dispatcher already knows. There's certain details in each load that we take that only the dispatcher and the driver knows. The nighttime dispatcher doesn't get that information. Hey, he's going to go here, he's due there, or he needs a data comm check, or this and that. Nighttime dispatch just pretty much handles breakdowns and little stuff like that. So that's what I mean by communication between the driver and dispatcher. It's like a relationship. Without one, there's not the other. And if I have a problem, then my dispatcher, I feel the dispatcher should resolve it, because my job is, I have a hard enough responsibility driving this truck. Their responsibility is to make sure I have all the tools that's needed in order to drive this truck, and that's where the issue happens at, and that's when the frustration comes in at.
Yeah, and so with your experience with dispatchers, you hear horror stories, you hear stories from people who love their dispatchers, anywhere from, well, what do you mean you can't get there today? It's only two inches on the map, to like dispatchers going out of their way to like, hey, you're stuck in a blizzard, I got you some DoorDash, just stay where you're at, stay safe, and we'll get you moving as soon as we can. I'm working on it in the background. In your opinion and your experience, because obviously you're closer to it than just about anybody as a driver, with your experience, what does good communication with the dispatcher look like versus bad communication, and them being the gatekeeper for your ability to make a living?
Dispatchers, the good part is that when they communicate with you, okay, you got your load, do you need anything? Are you okay? Do you understand where you're going? Stuff like that. That's a good dispatcher. Not saying a dispatcher should call you every day, but at least call you once or twice while you're on the run, just to see how you're doing mentally. How are you today? And call you by your name, not your truck number 969. Yep, whatever. That to me is not a communication kind of thing. I want to know that you care about me. That makes me do my job a lot better. You got some dispatchers out there, like you had said earlier. What do you mean by you can't make it? It's only 50 miles down the road. Yeah, it is 50 miles down the road, but I'm in California, and it's going to take me an hour and a half to get there. No, you're not. That's what I mean. When a dispatcher tells someone who's actually doing the job, has been out here for a while, compared to a dispatcher that's never been out here. Those are the worst dispatchers of all, most of the time, are the ones that never been in the truck, never been behind this wheel for 11 hours a day, never experienced the things that a truck driver goes through. Those can be the worst dispatchers out here that I've experienced.
And so you and I have shared some experiences over time, working together in and out of different carriers. With one of the instances that come to mind, and a topic that we've discussed in just friendly conversation and banter back and forth, was when dispatchers are needed the most is generally when a driver has a problem. And often where I see them falling short is when they're needed the most. Say your truck breaks down or your APU stops working. They don't understand what that APU does, or your AC when you're driving in the middle of the summer, and how it makes it very uncomfortable in that metal box rolling down the road in the middle of summer, and they just think you should keep progressing the load. And so you and I have had that conversation where we're like, well, hell, they don't understand it. Let's put them in a hot box with no AC, and you sit there or move their desk into the middle of the blacktop yard, and you work the same hours you're asking me to drive, and you can go home and into the AC once I get to where I'm supposed to go, where they're trying to make you achieve. So one of the instances I want to kind of bring light on is those situations, and I know you've had them. We've shared some of those together. So I guess what I'm asking you is, in the worst case scenario, the worst thing that a dispatcher can do, if you had to offer some shed of light onto helping them progress into being a good dispatcher, what would that be? What would that look like to you as a driver?
Not be available when they're needed the most. You call there's always a phone number to call. Call your dispatcher. All right, you call the dispatcher. Oh, they're out to lunch. What do you mean by they're out to lunch? Oh, they're outside taking a personal phone call. What do you mean? I'm broken down, or my APU is out, or I need them. Well, can I help you? Or they'll call you back. Okay, all right, you're busy. I get it. Call me back. Hour and a half later, you call back. Where's my dispatch? Oh, they went home for the day. Can I help you with something? That's what I'm talking about right there. That right there. And I'm chatting my blood right now.
So often, and correct me at any point if you disagree with me, Skip, often from my experiences as a dispatcher, or as a driver, I should say, from my experiences as a driver, what I've seen is nights and weekends is where we as an industry generally fall short across the board. We find a Band-Aid crew, and then we use the crutch of saying it's a Band-Aid crew to tell the driver, hey, suck it up, buttercup. It's a Band-Aid crew. Talk to your dispatcher in the morning, when we should be in the industry experience that we all bring to the table as transportation. We've been around forever. And to sit there and say, hey, we have a Band-Aid situation, and again, driver, you're the bargaining chip. Your experience really doesn't matter as much on nights as it does during the day when it's convenient for us as a carrier to put our best foot forward. I think we fall short as an industry bringing our best foot forward 24 hours a day. Whether the driver breaks down at night or in the morning, we should be able to bring that 5-star experience and help that driver in their time of need, no matter the time of day. I think we've come far enough as an industry to be able to do that. I mean, wouldn't you agree, Skip?
I would definitely agree with that. And with today's technology, I think it should be very, to me, should be easier. When I call the main line and my dispatcher is not available, then whoever's on duty should be able to put a note in there to say, hey, truck number, whatever, so-and-so, Skip Lawrence is called, and, here's a message for his dispatcher. Now, if it's something like real important, call the dispatcher at home. I don't have to have the dispatcher's number at home, the home number, but you have it. Call them at home. You know what? Let me call your dispatcher real quick, and I'll call you right back. Whether it be 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Put a note in the system so whoever gets it, aka managers, can say, hey, that guy's got an issue. Or the dispatcher should be able to say, hey, this guy here, this particular driver here, by name, watch out for this, because this could happen, or watch out for that. And that way the manager can coordinate accordingly so the driver is not out here on their own, frustrated and upset, and you want to know why companies lose good drivers. Fair enough?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair point. And to actually go down that rabbit hole a little bit further is, how do you feel about dispatchers with all this technology we have calling you during your off time? They won't be bothered in their off time. You can't even get a hold of them if they're on their lunch break. But when you're on your hours of service break, which everyone can see, you still get calls. It's a very common complaint I hear from a lot of drivers is, I'm getting calls when I'm off. So,
and I agree with that. They do that. Yes, go ahead.
So my question to you is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is that issue for you in today's world with all this tech we have? Is that still an issue that's as hot button of an issue as it was back when you and I worked together, or has it kind of remedied itself with technology lately?
Well, with technology, they know exactly where we're at. They know where we're at. What we're doing is that the dispatchers, I get it. They have a lot of us. They have to babysit, blah, blah, blah. I think the dispatchers are overwhelmed. I think they have too many drivers that they have to be responsible for. That's a whole lot of personality. And it can be hard to keep up with. That's why I feel the notes are in there. Hey, my driver is on his break. This driver is on his break. This driver is on his break. This driver is on his break, so on, so on, so on. They don't use what they have. And I think that's part of the issue is I feel that these companies do not use the technology that they already have, or they haven't purchased that piece of that technology that they have. For me personally, when I first get with a dispatcher, I explain to them the kind of person that I am. And once that happens, that's it. But if you cross that line, I bite your head off, and then we go back to the drawing table.
So kind of on that note, and this is more of a, hey, do you agree? And this is just kind of my take on it too. So, I got 3 kids. Our number one rule at home is own your shit. Basically, like, you can't move forward from a problem if you don't acknowledge that there's a problem, and you can't go find a solution. And I think in that communication between the driver and the dispatcher, that ancient war that's been waged for 100+ years now, but how important do you think that is? Like, would you agree with that statement? The most important thing a dispatcher could do is own a situation, whether it's the company fell short, whether it's beyond, versus doubling down and saying, no, this is the way it is. That flexibility and the ability to own that there's a situation that's not right that needs to be remedied.
I agree. I have to own the load that I'm on. It's my responsibility. And you being dispatcher, you have to own your part of it too. If I call you and say, hey, I'm having an issue, don't tell me, well, you got to call so-and-so. No. Your responsibility is to call that individual and then have that individual either call me or you call me back. That's what I'm used to, and I think that's what happens a lot of times is the dispatchers say, oh, well, that's not my problem. You got to call this number. Well, you got to call this number. And that's, again, that frustrates you. So like you said earlier, own up to your shit at the end of the day. And so that's where I'm at with that.
And I think to his point, I agree with that fully. In any other job, we have to own our shit, whether it's at home, at work. I don't understand why, as an industry, drivers have to own up and be the bargaining chip, as we've discussed in a couple scenarios here. Why not everyone else? Why not just own up to it, take control of it, and take responsibility? That driver's driving. That is an 80,000-pound vehicle going 60 miles an hour or more at any given time. Why should they have to call another number? You as the dispatcher, in my idea of what I think makes a successful dispatcher from my time in the truck would, instead of telling me to dial another number while I'm driving down the road or having to stop the progression of my load or deal with an issue outside of an issue I'm already dealing with, you should get on that phone. You're right there at a desk. You're sitting in the comfort of an office. 3-way that call. Go that extra mile. Help me, help the company, versus sending me chasing my tail on any particular issue, which is often what the drivers complain about.
I agree. And that's why, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. And that's why, it'd be a good idea is to get a dispatcher on, a couple of dispatchers on here to see their side. Because like they said, I recall you and I talked about this, Charles, how the battle's always is between the driver and the dispatcher, the driver and dispatcher, driver and dispatcher. Well, let's find out what the issue really is then between the driver and the dispatcher and see if we can come to a bargaining chip or somewhere, meet in the middle somewhere, because I'm willing to negotiate all day long. And I'm sure a lot of us drivers out here have no issue with negotiating. But you can't negotiate if you're not willing to negotiate. Both sides have to agree to disagree on certain things, and it's a push-pull. It has to be a push-pull. It's got to be a push-pull. I give, you give. I personally think the dispatchers have too many drivers underneath their belts.
I'd agree with you on that one. Being on the other side for some period of time, I've seen some models where it's a 5-to-1 ratio. I've seen some models where it's a 20-to-1 ratio. Well, law of averages, eventually that law of averages is going to go against the dispatcher, and the only person that's going to pay the price is the drivers on the reciprocating end, because that dispatcher's only got so much bandwidth, just like any other person. It's understandable that there's only so much. I think, again, it comes down to the transportation industry as a whole saying, hey, we have a problem here. We regulate everything else. Why can't we regulate this? There should be some sort of rule saying, hey, you can only, in classrooms, we have rules. There's a teacher-to-student ratio. We're dealing with the motoring public, big vehicles, big problems when they do arise. Why not have rules on this? I mean, what dictates we can regulate the drivers but not regulate who regulates the drivers and enforces those regulations on a daily basis? So again, it's one of those opportunities that we as an industry, I think, can grow upon. And much to your point, but back at it, Skip, we do actually. Our next guest is a dispatcher, been doing it for years. And I know we're coming to the close of our segment with you, so I thought it'd be a great way to introduce our next guest. And before we do that, thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for everything that you do to keep America moving forward. And just in general, thank you.
No problem. Thank you for having me on.
And now I'm going to bring us over to the other side of things. I got Justin Palionis, somebody that has matured through the dispatch ranks over his time within transportation and can share experiences both good and bad from that time that he's been in here and what he's learned from it. We're talking about dispatching and what makes a successful dispatcher-driver relationship versus what can make a doom and gloom scenario. And as you know, there's two sides to every coin here. You got the drivers saying dispatchers control my pay, dispatchers control everything. You got the dispatcher saying the drivers control their pay and their performance dictates that. And then I know from working with you and in the office that there's also a side of this that often is missed, that the dispatchers are getting pressed from two ends. They're getting pressed from the drivers, and then they're getting pressed from the operations manager and upper management. So that's why I thought it was nice to bring you into the show to offer that perspective and just kind of show us and tell us about what you find being successful as a dispatcher, what you find is successful as forming that relationship so you can both hit goal and be happy with where you're sitting within an organization.
Okay, well, from my experience in dispatch, usually I treat the driver-dispatcher relationship as like sort of as equals, as colleagues. Even when my title says some kind of manager or anything, I don't ever present myself as a manager. I almost present myself as like, hey, listen, we're trying to make you money. Obviously, we're trying to make revenue for the company, but it's like I want to have a good relationship with him. I want to keep him happy, but at the same time, you're kind of doing the balancing act at the same time in the background, keeping operations, upper management happy too by bringing in revenue for the company. I always kind of try whenever I can. I give drivers choices, whether it is of loads or whether it is how they would like to approach the load. So it doesn't seem like I'm the authoritarian type of manager or, the company is forcing them to do something, even though they, most company drivers do have to do a certain load. So, giving that leeway kind of shows that you have trust in them and that you think they are fully capable of doing the job. That's always been my approach to it. And sometimes, obviously some drivers are not as capable and they do drop the ball and you end up having to kind of reel them in and, guide them, be like a little bit more up close and personal and guide them through certain situations to kind of avoid that. But that's been my approach. It's worked really well, as well as being upfront with everything. I always tell the drivers, even when I first meet them, I am going to tell you the truth, whether it is good, whether it is bad, but I will always be honest.
Communication is a big part of that, I'd imagine. Being a dispatcher and you relying on the driver's updates and communicating your expectations with the drivers, but also I'm sure they communicate their expectations to you. I know I did when I was a driver. So communication's huge, I'd imagine. And our previous guest, on this episode, Skip Lawrence was talking about communication being key to what he finds is successful in just about anything in trucking, whether it be given appreciation or the driver-dispatcher relationship. So what's communication look like to you? What's a successful relationship, and what component does communication play in that successful relationship?
Usually I see the best communication from drivers who you've developed a certain level of trust and relationship. But even early on, like certain drivers you see where they give you like, they text me, hey, I'm loaded. They don't have to necessarily, they could just do the loaded call in the system, but they let me know that they're done with a certain aspect of the load. And I don't have to go into the system looking and checking where they are. They're like, they give me a little bit heads up. Listen, my ETA for delivery has changed, for tomorrow. It's going to be 9 a.m. And, those little updates help me. And I always thank them. And I'm like, listen, this only helps me, reload you with the next load and make money. So that's, like when I see that, those kind of updates, that's a good sign that, great communication.
With communication and you talking about those updates from the driver and you setting those expectations early on, I'd imagine that, like you said earlier, it's a balancing act. But when do you see that balance becoming imbalanced? Because Skip was talking about like nights and weekends, how a lot of times it's the Band-Aid and it's being referred back to the dispatcher. I'm sure when you come in the morning and this stuff's all being dumped on your plate and then you got drivers waiting in queue to get a hold of you because the people that were covering you when you were off didn't handle the situation and just left it basically sitting like, here, good morning, here you go, good luck, and then they're out. I mean, what's that look like for you? Because we want to get both sides to this, and I've seen your side. I've worked alongside you a couple times and watched you navigate some real choppy waters with finesse. So speak to me a little bit about how you do that, how you handle that pressure coming in every day and not knowing what you're walking into.
Well, yes. With previous couple companies that I've worked for, we had after-hours dispatch, and it was a little frustrating where sometimes the drivers would not get the help they needed. Now being, put in this current position where I have control over the terminal and some other duties, I kind of changed that whole, I don't just let them call after hours. I always have my phone on me, within reason. Like, if it's like 2 a.m., I'd prefer they would call after hours, but I'm usually up at 5 a.m. So I'm almost available full day. And that way I can actually help them through. And I actually even have a laptop that I travel with. So maybe I'm more available than the usual dispatcher, but that's helped me a lot, like fix those issues where a driver might call after hours and after hours might not know what to do. And then there's this huge communication issue where they kind of lose trust, because they don't have anybody to help after I'm gone. So that's kind of how I've alleviated some of those concerns and some of those issues.
So when we're talking this hands-on, because you hit the nail on the head from what Skip was asking for from his dispatchers in relationship. He said, hey, when my issue arises, if my dispatcher's at lunch, there should be a way to communicate to them the importance of my situation so that my dispatcher may relate back to me on that issue rather than make me wait till after lunch or after they went home. And then I'm relying on nights and weekends and just the waiting game. So it's interesting that you have seen that same issue in the past, and now that you have control over your situation, you've addressed it by saying, hey, I want to maintain that control to a level. I want to be available for those situations. And the response that you're getting from the drivers, I'd imagine that that's pretty positive response, comparatively speaking, to what you've seen in the past.
Yeah, they definitely see me, like what I said before. Like I never try to be a manager that's, that puts myself above anybody. I give them the same respect that they give me back, basically.
So I'm a firm believer that in order to be good at your job, you have to know how to be bad at your job. And you obviously sound like, you know what you're doing. You've been doing it for a long time. But what are some things, because obviously this is a point of contention in a lot of places because obviously some people aren't great at it. So my question to you is, like, looking around the industry and, you talked about drivers having trust issues coming in because of previous experiences. What do you see around the industry are problems in the dispatch area?
The newer dispatchers, it's just you have such a wide variety of drivers. There's so many different personalities. And another thing is, like, when you get pressure from ops from up top, you have to do these loads. There's ways that you can tell a driver without making it seem like, like the way you break the news also. And obviously, like, number one is always tell the truth, be honest. So, regardless of the situation, like, I've seen dispatchers lose complete and utter trust by lying about a simple thing, like saying, like, oh, I'll get you home. Just this load, you'll get it done. But them knowing that in that area, there's no chance of him coming back home. But I always set expectations. I'm like, let's say I have to do an account, but I know that it's going into a bad area. I'm like, listen, we have to do this account, but out of this area, there's a very small chance that I'm going to be able to get you home. And even though that news sucks, you're being honest, and that goes a long way.
Last question for me. What do you think could be done to create a better environment for dispatchers to feel less of a need to cave under that pressure and create this, like, say whatever I have to say mentality? Like, what could a carrier do to make a dispatcher not feel like they're in that position?
Well, that's why the funny thing you say that, because the company that I work for currently, very much, it seems to be very supportive and they're very pro driver, but at the same time, they give you the tools in order to help the driver. Basically, what I'm saying is, if you have these programs to encourage drivers to perform well, that helps, especially newer dispatchers, get their feet wet and start understanding the industry and not making the same mistakes that I made.
I always think back to how fortunate I was to experience some of these things on both sides. And one of the most unique experiences that I had was watching a new driver and a new to that driver dispatcher meet for the first time. So being the recruiter for that driver, I got to hear the driver make a comment that, oh, I'm going to get this new dispatcher. When I talk to them, I'm going to break them in. And then I walked around and I talked to the dispatcher, and uniquely enough, the dispatcher was having a conversation with another dispatcher about, oh, I got this new driver talking about the one that they just got. I got to break them in. So knowing that that conversation's taking place, and I've heard it more times than once, but the first time was very enlightening to know that both parties are going in there ready to butt heads. From 30 feet above, I'm sitting there looking at this like, what if everyone entered it with exactly the same mindset as what you're discussing? This is a relationship. Your success is contingent on the driver knowing their expectations and doing the job. And their success is contingent on you knowing their expectations and doing your job. So if we went into the relationship knowing that and working together, I see a greater benefit than coming in trying to decide who's alpha and who's beta in this relationship, which is often the case. And I'm interested to see your feedback if you notice that head button starts early on.
Yeah, it usually starts, like you said, especially if it's a new dispatcher getting a new group of drivers. Like, let's say I got hired by a company and I take over somebody's drivers. They tend to, it's like, I'm the new guy. The way you present yourself is very, very important in the beginning. After years of experience, the way I do it now is I just set the grounds. Okay, this is the company's policy. This is what we're trying to do. This is what we're trying to accomplish. And then I give a few, easy loads to see to feel out how the driver responds, how he does, how he, whether he starts his clock early, how he manages his hours. And I always give suggestions. I don't get, it's like, I don't want to throw him in the deep end of the pool immediately. And I always give suggestions, not tell him, okay, this is how you should do it. I always say it's going to be for your own benefit, because you're here to make money, right? You in the end, that's what we're all here to do.
You mentioned how you share with them, hey, this is the expectation. This is what you're going to achieve. Letting them know those expectations early on, and this is how you should have done it. This is why. I imagine as a dispatcher and not being a driver in the past, do you ever get pushback from the drivers saying, hey, you don't know this job? And maybe you might actually give some credit to it. I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but maybe you've had that encounter a couple times where drivers just don't respond to you the same way they would to if you had driven. And if that's the case, how do you address that? How do you get past that? Because obviously you guys are in two different sides of the business, just like they've never dispatched, so they can't put themselves in your place.
Usually I do it with I give them examples, because obviously it's much easier for me now, dispatching for a while. Like, I've seen so many different scenarios. I can basically give example for almost anything. So, it's like whether it's the way they run their clock. A driver was trying to ask me about being an LP, brand new driver. He was a safe driver, a good driver, but he was taking 10 breaks during his clock. So my suggestions are like, listen, this is why you're making this much revenue. And I show him, you have to prove with what's in front of you to show him how he can improve his own efficiency, which not necessarily, yes, it'll benefit the company, but that's not how I approach it. I approach it by, this is going to benefit you. And eventually he took very good response to it, and he's improved his overall performance. You're not going to tell a driver, hey, listen, you're stopping too many times to go to the bathroom. That you're never. That sounds unprofessional, and at the same time, that's going to, probably not go the right way with the driver-dispatcher relationship. So basically, that's the way I approach it, just to try to encourage them and show them how they can improve their own performance so it improves their own paycheck.
Yeah, that is a valid approach in my mind, and I think finding a way to connect those dots for the dispatcher and the driver is probably the most logical way to approach it. And I'm glad that we're going to end on that note, because it resonates well with the communication piece that we keep hearing back from people. So, Justin, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your contribution to Cents Per Mile and offering us some insight from a dispatcher's point of view.
Thank you for having me.
I mean, I think what it ultimately boils down is the idea that the dispatcher is the gateway to the driver's paycheck. So I think empathy is huge. I think that just like, with recruiters, I think the empathy of understanding that driver is somewhere that you're not, and their needs might be more pressing. I could see, and I've seen situations where it's really easy to just kind of pass the driver off as being dramatic, but you don't know that. You're not there, and that's, the case. So I think open communication and trust that everybody has the best interests, which is something that has to be earned, especially at this point in the industry with how things have worked for so long.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that. And, with my experiences with the dispatch and being a driver, I can honestly say that I think the one thing is this industry has a habit of over time making some people callous to people's individual situations, having that empathy that we keep talking about throughout the process, and understanding that we're dealing with people, different comfort zones. You sitting at your desk telling the driver to calm down and keep progressing is a lot easier said than the driver driving through the blizzard trying to make you happy, who's white-knuckling it. And the more uncomfortable they are, the more of a danger they become on the road to the general motoring public, the same roads that my wife and child might be on, or your family. So it's in the best interest for us to have that faith in the driver. If they know they're uncomfortable, listen to them. At the same point, if I'm a driver, properly communicating to the dispatcher what I need, not leaving it up for interpretation, letting them know what I need and my expectations, that's going to help me help myself. And that's just something, sometimes we go back to that conversation where They butt heads. It becomes a power struggle. Who's going to break who in? And I'm not sure that's the right approach, not for a driver or dispatcher. And the fact that you enter the relationship like that, it seems like it's kind of set up to fail. But if we entered that relationship saying, hey, we're going to set these proper expectations. I'm here to make you money. You're here to make me look good because you're going to make a lot of money for yourself and the company. And we're all going to be happy and kumbaya. If I was a dispatcher, my takeaway from today's segment would be, listen, be empathetic, and understand that just because you're sitting at the desk, you get to go home. You're not personally dealing with this issue. It might seem like a stressful issue on the phone, but that driver's physically in there, needing you to be their rock in that hard space that they're at. And you need to be there. And the more that you're there and build that trust with them, the easier it's going to get with that driver throughout time. My takeaway for the driver is understanding that the industry has created a problem where the way we're set up, these dispatchers are oftentimes spread thin. So a little understanding. I'm not saying to give them a free pass when you get the shaft from your dispatcher, of course. But if that dispatcher's tied up with 20 other trucks, it's probably not by their choice. It's probably by some system that someone designed in a boardroom somewhere saying this was a great idea, and not thinking about the overall driver experience or when things go wrong. And the law of averages, things can go wrong all at once, that the dispatcher might just be spread thin. So a little patience and understanding.
No, I would agree with those things. And I mean, I think my big ultimate takeaway is that it's a two-way street. You have to listen to the driver, like you said, because they're the one physically in the situation. But you also have to understand that it's the dispatcher who's going to have the ability to get you out. Now, I've had experience with companies where if you don't like your dispatcher or you don't get along with your dispatcher because different people have different personalities, you can swap dispatchers. And sometimes that's an easy fix. But then I think to circle way back is, why do you have to switch dispatchers instead of the company switching dispatchers to a different one? I don't know. That's just something to think about, but it's a pretty solid day.
Yeah, I want to thank our guests for joining us on Cents Per Mile. I'm your host, Charles Gracey.
And I'm your co-host, Paul Gibson. Have a good one.